Hey, everybody. Thanks for being with us. Happy Ash Wednesday, and thank you for joining us as we continue through the Gospel of John. We move into the 16th chapter, and I'll say two things about our passage today, or at least the first part, depending on how long it takes us. We probably should have done it yesterday and included it with yesterday's reading, and I might even go so far as to say it should be included in the 15th chapter. This is an odd place structurally to break the chapter. But a little bit of recap. Yesterday, Jesus is warning the disciples that the times ahead will be difficult for them and that the world has harbored a resentment, a hatred, he calls it, toward Jesus, and so that the disciples should not be surprised when that gets pointed at them as well. And today, he adds to that a little bit. So let me read just a few verses here, and we'll go back and give it some context. I have said these things to you to keep you from stumbling. They will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, an hour is coming when they will kill you, and they will think that by doing so they are offering worship to God. And they will do this because they have not known the Father or me. But I have said these things to you so that when that hour comes, you may remember that I told you about it. So again, this is very much an extension of what Jesus had said. Jesus said, that there will be a time when you're at odds with the world. And now Jesus points out for the disciples and for the church that's listening in to these words later, how difficult those days will be. They'll put you out of the synagogue. And this is a powerful sentence, I think, Michael. They will kill you. And is, as if that's not a strong enough statement, they will think they're worshiping God by doing so. They will justify what they do. And the they here is clearly the Jewish religious authorities. That's the people that Jesus is fighting with in the early wave of the evolution of the church. That's the people that Christians are struggling with. The Roman opposition comes later. The Gospel of John likely reflects a time where there's significant tension between Jewish religion and Christian religion. And I think that's a stunning statement. They will think they are offering worship by doing so. And so I suppose one of the things this does is to intensify yesterday's words. It's one thing to think that there'll be some general conflict and some rough patches between the world and the faith, but this is, at times, Jesus says, life or death. Again, if you know the gospel story, we're headed to the cross. Maybe it's not particularly surprising, but I think these are sobering words.
Yeah, it is really hard for us to get our mind around, I think, the schism of what's happening here, but bear with me for a minute. What Jesus is saying is that when you consider yourself, because remember, the earliest church thought of themselves as being Jewish Christians, that they thought of synagogue as a place that worked with the faith, right? That Jesus himself taught where? In the synagogue. So that was the context of being people of faith. But here in our text, it is made abundantly clear that there will come a day when you can no longer think of those things as being synonymous, that those two things can't live in the same context. That's a heart-rending reality for the earliest Christians. And I do think it's wise that we connect this to the why. Why is this going to be your experience? And that is connected to verse 27. If you lead us off, Clint, with the idea that we should have included these together, I think that 27 is a classic example. Why? Because you are going to testify because you've been with me in the beginning. And what will that testifying result in? It's going to result in this reality in the world. It's going to change your relationship with the people who you've always thought to be brothers and sisters in the faith. And Clint, I just think that separation, the cost of following Jesus, John is not shy about. John is not saying that Christians are going to get there because they want it, or that Christians are going to have sought out their own pain. he's not saying that Christians are going to find themselves opposite the world because the gospel somehow makes us people who put ourselves in position of always being in pain. No, it's that when we testify to the truth of who Jesus is, that will create the very same division that John has exemplified Jesus having with those religious leaders the entire way. And so his commandments that Jesus just gave just a few verses ago about love, about how we're going to love one another. We're going to love as Jesus has demonstrated that kind of love. That becomes the sinew that holds it all together. Clint, that's what keeps Christian community strong in the midst of a world that doesn't know what to do with it. When the world presses in with that pressure, even pressure that's going to look to from the world's eyes as doing good, as actually bringing glory and praise to God, that's the kind of thing that Christians are going to have to bow up under. And the way that we'll do it, by the power of the Spirit at work, we had that yesterday, and of course the fruits of love growing within that community. That's the way that Christians repel the force of the world and the separation and the pain and all these things we're talking about.
I think there are, just sort of in a general sense of thinking about our discipleship, Michael, I think there are probably two mistakes that Christians make when it comes to verses like this. And the one is to be obsessed with them and sort of look for conflict, right? The idea that, oh, someone made fun of me for going to church, that's persecution. We in America are so blessed that we sometimes take for granted the idea that we can worship publicly. You and I, hundreds and hundreds of times, have come to this church, never once, not a single moment spent wondering if somebody would show up and stop us, if someone would cart us off, never once fearing that it would be discovered. We put it on our sign, we put it in the paper, it's on our website, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so on one hand, we can minimize the idea of opposition to those things that just frustrate us. Oh, my uncle who's not a Christian makes fun of the faith. Well, okay, but I think that minimizes true persecution. And the other mistake, and maybe the one that Americans are more often guilty of, is to think that our situation is normative and to forget that there are places in the world today that remain dangerous for Christians. There are Christians who risk their lives to worship and own Bibles and read scripture together and have worship together. That is dangerous in parts of our world. And I think an awareness of that helps us, to keep our own minor struggles in proper perspective, but also leads us to pray and to support and to reach out to those who are struggling. And I think one of the disconnects of our experience, and again, we are so blessed, but the scripture is written in a time that reflects the risk that this is a life and death decision that these people are making at times to follow Christ. And, Jesus says it here, I've told you this so that when it comes, you may remember what I've said. You can be ready. And again, we believe John to have been written in a time that the church is experiencing some persecution. And so these words and these themes become massively important in the early evolutions of the church, in which it is a risk, it is a struggle, it costs these people something. It is a chance that they take when they put their faith and they live their life as a Christian. And so I think, I don't know exactly what we do with these passages, but I think they're important because they give us both hopefully some courage, some awareness, but I think also some perspective.
Clint, this is a thing that John has done now a couple times that I find really beautiful and I really appreciate is John, and look at this language explicitly in verse 4. I've said these things to you so that when their hour comes, you may remember, right? We know that this gospel is being given to us by John so that we have what we need as people of faith to know who Jesus is. And the honesty of this gospel is to say that there's a lot of things that the disciples did not understand when they heard them, but in Jesus's own wording, I want this said so that when the time comes, you will remember this conversation. You'll remember that when I was with you, I promised an advocate. When I was with you, I told you that the servant will not be greater than the master. That when I was with you, I said times of persecution would come, so that when the doubt comes, when the struggle is great, when your life is literally being asked of you, that you might know that this request has not been unseen, that this cost has not been missed, but that rather you are stepping in firm view of the providence of what God has already laid out, of what Jesus said would happen, that you stand on firm ground and that your witness is grounded in reality. That's what John's trying to do, is trying to show that Jesus is not just teaching those people in the room that night. Jesus is looking ahead to those who will follow him and is making very clear he is just as much Lord when the road is difficult as when he's Lord when he's with you in the room. And I think the text goes on, Clint, as we'll continue in this study, we're going to discover that Jesus is going to say more about the reality of that. But I think at this stage, we would be wise, I think, to hear in Jesus's words, not a call to go out with some sort of immaturity or to look for trouble, but the reality is that we might have confidence that when trouble inevitably finds us, that Jesus is the Lord still in that moment.
At no level is the goal to be persecuted. The goal is to be faithful. And if that faithfulness comes in the midst of persecution, then we should not be surprised. Because while all the Gospels include this theme, John maybe most passionately portrays Jesus as the one who is faithful in the midst of opposition. We've seen intense conflicts already here, and I think maybe perhaps more intensely than they are portrayed at the same place in the other gospel accounts. That you could argue that, but John has wanted us to know from the very beginning that Jesus presses on in the face of significant opposition so that he can be faithful to his calling, so that he can be faithful to his mission and his personhood as the Messiah, his role as the Son of God. And we now are going to inherit that. And so the idea isn't to go out there and find suffering and then pat ourselves on the back because we found it. The idea is to be faithful and not shocked when being faithful sometimes invites difficulty with it, because the world doesn't love faithfulness. And Jesus lines that out here explicitly. And again, in a culture where there's not a great deal of true risk to be a Christian, I think we both want to be grateful for that, aware of how that might lead us to complacency, and certainly understand that that's not the case for everyone. There are brothers and sisters who live under the reality of risk because they follow Christ. And if that's not us in the moment we're in, then we should be both thankful and aware of supporting, encouraging, and praying for those for whom it is true.
I'm certainly conscious, Clint, that we've not made it many verses here today.
I think that's okay for Ash Wednesday.
But I do think that there's some wisdom in even honing in on verse 3 here, since we've got the time. They will do this because they've not known the Father or me. And I submit to you, and push back on this, Clip. I submit to you that this is a very good rubric for measuring whatever sense of persecution we might have. If you are in a position in which you find yourself meeting headwind because of the faith, you might ask yourself, is this because I know the Father? And is this because I know the Son? Are you acting like Jesus acts? Because, Clint, you and I both know that there are people who call themselves persecuted Christians who are acting far outside the ethic of Jesus Christ, who are living outside the kingdom way of living, of faithfulness. That's existed in all times and places. That's just a reality of being human, that we're tempted to make it about us instead about the one who calls us to the cross. So I think the rubric then becomes very powerful. Are we being called to account because we are testifying to Jesus Christ, who came, gave, died, sacrificed, and gave up? Are we giving testimony to God, who is almighty and the one whom we follow and the one who has grace and mercy and love for all? Or are we in some way seeking for power, for fame, for privilege, for accumulations of all kind, for our own benefit? That rubric matters in the midst of persecution, especially in our context. I think, you're right to point out there are countries in our modern world today where simply possessing the Bible, but the collection of books that have been preserved and given to us by the historic faith as a way to see the revelation of Jesus Christ, simply possessing that book is in itself enough to cause the giving of your life. I think for Christians who don't fear that, we find ourselves tempted by this gradual scale of what persecution is and what it isn't. And I think the rubric of persecution is Christ-like if it is that thing known by the Father and known by the Son. If it resonates with their character, that is where Christians are called to be. That's what to be a disciple means, to be a follower. To be a Christian means to be a little Christ. That should be our sole focus instead of taking pride in whatever difficulty of faith we might be having, as some are wont to do.
I think historically, this idea and this word persecution has been very serious and has had sometimes life-threatening ramifications. And so when we apply that word to lesser struggles and lesser challenges, I think we need to certainly be conscious that we're doing that. And I think we need to be careful in not undervaluing what the church has historically spoken of. And certainly I think what the scripture speaks of as persecution. We may all hit some bumps in the road because we're Christian, and probably should if we're being faithful. But not all of them will rise to the level of what the scripture and church history has typically called persecution. And we want to be careful so that we don't minimize the idea that there really have been and currently are people who risk their very lives more than, discomfort, more than inconvenience, more than disagreement. The gospel has been dangerous for people. And we just want to be very careful including ourselves in that for lesser reasons. I think that does a disservice to them and us, again, while simultaneously saying that our faith should disconnect us from the world at places, and
Right.
and we should experience some differences and some discomforts because of it. I think we want to be careful how we talk about those
Don't
things.
oversimplify things that have depth. And also, I would say, be mindful that the people who lose their life for the faith are not losing it because they're carrying an NIV Bible instead of an NRSV Bible. It's because they claim Jesus. I mean, that it boils down to the one that they claim to be Lord and Savior. Sometimes we get fixated on details if we're people in the faith, but know that simply who we call Lord is in most cases the dividing line, and that's a life-orienting choice that we've made, and those who make it can often and have often found the implications of that choice.
Yeah, we have the luxury and therefore the challenge of living out our faith in a mostly non-dangerous context. And so that brings with it some particular difficulties that we have to navigate.
That's enough for today. We're glad that you were with us. Hope
Yeah.
that this conversation has been helpful, challenging, meaningful for you. Give it a like if it has. Well, I can't tell you strongly enough how much that matters in terms of other people being able to find the study after we are done together. So I hope you'll do that. Subscribe so that you can stay with us on the journey. We will be back tomorrow and look forward to continuing on through the Gospel of John.
Just want to add, if you are not in our First Press
Oh.
community and you're interested in these kind of conversations, we will be offering an Ash Wednesday devotion this evening. It will just be online. It won't be live, but if these are kind of thoughts that you're interested in and you're not in our community, we're grateful that you listen. And if you'd like to hear more, that will be up on our website. You'll find links later on in the day.
We will see you all tomorrow.